Planning to add a new refrigerator to an old boat or upgrading your existing fridge? There is a lot to think about. Hi there, I'm Carolyn Sherlock, and on this episode of the Boat Galley Podcast, I'll share the 4 fridge components you need to think about to make smart choices. But first, let's talk about our sponsor. Today's episode of the Boat Galley Podcast is sponsored by Aquamap, the most advanced navigation app for your tablet or phone. Aquamap allows for easy route planning with overlays from Active Captain and the Waterway Guide. Tides, currents, waypoints, an anchor alarm, even weather. It's all here. Upgrading to Aquamap Master brings in all Army Corps of Engineers survey overlays, as well as U.S. notices to mariners and more, invaluable for cruising the ICW and the Bahamas. Find Aquamap, careful there's no S on the end of it, wherever you find your apps. If you're installing a boat refrigerator for the first time, or doing a major upgrade on your existing system, you may be overwhelmed by the decisions you're having to make simultaneously. Perhaps a few thoughts here will provide a little bit of a framework for you. Like many things in cruising, from your choice of boat to the route you take, there are no universal answers in choosing a boat refrigerator system. But understanding how one decision will impact others can narrow down the range of appropriate choices for your situation. Okay, adding or upgrading a boat refrigerator isn't really like going out to an appliance store, buying the one you like, and having it delivered. Now, there are ones that are sold as standalone, and with those you may have a few less choices, but you still are going to have to think about all 4 of these concepts. First is power and how you're going to supply it. Second is where you'll install the compressor. In the drop-in ones, it's already built in. Same thing with the box. The size, location, and construction must all be considered. Even if you're buying one that's an all-in-one drop-in, you need to think about how it's constructed because that will tell you a lot about how much power it will use and how cold it will keep all of your items. And finally, you need to think about what brand you want. For most cruisers, the first question with regard to refrigeration are how much power will it draw and how can I use the power? Your other choices will determine how much power the refrigerator uses, as will even your choice of how you power it. If your refrigerator is next to the engine compartment, as is typical on many boats, which is a serious design flaw, running the engine to provide power, whether via the alternator to the batteries or directly for an engine-driven system, actually will heat up the box and cause you to need even more power to cool it down. The same is true if the refrigerator is next to a generator compartment. Relatively few boats opt for engine-driven refrigeration anymore. With an engine-driven system, you can run the engine a couple times a day, generally for 30 to 60 minutes at a time, to cool down large chill plates, and then keep the box cool until the next run time. There are several disadvantages to that system. You're tied to a schedule for running the engine, even if you're at the dock, anchored, or sailing along with plenty of wind. The temperature in the box will fluctuate over the course of the day, particularly in warm climates. It's almost impossible to have a freezer with an engine-driven system. And if you have a problem with your engine, you've just lost your refrigerator as well. Fuel cost and maintenance can add up, not to mention the extra engine hours you'll rack up. Okay, while some large boats opt for 110-volt systems using generators and inverters, and I've known a couple of trawlers that use RV propane systems, by far the majority of family cruisers opt for 12-volt systems. A 12-volt system operates off the main battery bank, and power for it can be generated any way you'd otherwise charge the batteries: solar, wind, a towing generator, alternator, shore power, or generator. Most boats use a combination, and virtually all have to increase their power generation capabilities when they install refrigeration if they haven't had it before. Now, two things to consider with a 12-volt system. If you are heading from a relatively cool climate to a hot one, say going from San Francisco to the Sea of Cortez or Maine to the Caribbean, expect to use a lot more power for your refrigeration than you're accustomed to. Lots of boats coming to the Sea of Cortez when we were there found themselves scurrying to add solar panels or buy a generator as the weather warmed up. You need to make sure your battery bank is sized for the load you'll be putting on it. Every system is different as to how efficient it is, but it's likely you'll need 100 amp hours or more a day just for the refrigerator if you're in a hot climate. Okay, the compressor. More and more boat refrigerators are coming as all-in-one units, but many still have a separate compressor. If you choose one with a separate compressor, it's worth taking a bit of time to think about where you can and where you should place the compressor. Yeah, you've got to find a place where there's room, and that may seriously limit the choices. But don't just opt for the first place that you find. In simple terms, most compressors work by transporting heat from the refrigerant to the air around it. It will operate much more efficiently if there is good airflow around it, and if it's kept as cool as possible, and if the air that reaches it is also as cool as possible. Putting the compressor in the engine compartment is not good, nor is putting it in any enclosed location with only small louvers for air circulation. A few systems use a keel cooler that transfers heat to the water instead of air cooling. With these, of course, there's little choice in placement. But you also have to consider the distance from the refrigerator box, as the refrigerant has to make a full loop from the compressor to the evaporator in the box and back. Bends in the tubing and also a long distance make for more resistance to the circulation of the refrigerant, and hence a less efficient system. Be sure to check the specs before buying a compressor to be sure it will work in your planned location. And another important consideration is access for maintenance, recharging the system, and other repairs. I'll admit, access is never good on a boat, but at least don't put it where you have to stand on your head or dismount the compressor to check a trouble light or recharge the system. Okay, let's talk about the box. 10 years ago, the box for most boat refrigerators was custom made. Now, far more are drop-in units. Either way, though, you have a number of choices to make. First is whether you want top loading or front loading. If you're used to a shore refrigerator, front loading just seems so much more natural. And yes, it is easier to see what's in there. But front loaders have a nasty tendency to have food fall out if the boat moves while the door is open. And you need to install clear plastic strips to keep as much cold in the refrigerator as possible when the door is open, or live with just losing more air. The opening needs to be either fore or aft facing in a sailboat. Otherwise, everything will fall out on one tack or the other. I've had both top loading and front loading. I seriously prefer the top loader, which we had on our first boat. With a bunch of bins to keep things organized, I could find things quickly. They stayed in place no matter what tack we were on or how rough the seas. I was even able to open the refrigerator and make sandwiches while we were riding out a hurricane at anchor and rolling gunnel to gunnel. Well, we have a front loader now, and I'm struck by how much more often I have to defrost because every time I open the door, warm, moist air rushes in and we lose all that cold air. Okay, let's talk about the size of your refrigerator. To some extent, a smaller refrigerator is more efficient as there is less space to cool. And have a refrigerator full of cold items as opposed to air is more efficient. But you also need some airspace in the refrigerator for that cool to circulate. And if things are so tightly packed that you have to remove half of what's in the refrigerator to get the item you need out, well, that's not efficient either. A very deep refrigerator can cause problems. One of the top gripes for many women is standing on my head to get things out of the refrigerator bottom. And let's face it, you want a refrigerator that's large enough to hold what you want it to. And that's a personal feeling. You may want enough meat, drinks, and veggies for a month at a time, or just enough food for a weekend. It's all up to you. Okay, location. If you're just redoing the refrigerator, you're probably more or less locked into a location. But if you're redoing the whole galley, the top priority should be to keep the refrigerator away from the engine compartment, and the second priority should be to keep the refrigerator away from the hull and the sun heating it up. The more it's away from anywhere that the sun will beat down on it, such as next to a companionway, the better. Let's talk about insulation. In general, the thicker and higher the R value, the better. Materials are constantly evolving, so I won't make specific recommendations. Of course, if you have limited space, the thickness of insulation is a trade-off with space inside the refrigerator. General design. Okay, a lid that latches down instead of just being held by gravity or a magnetic strip, and it's got a thick gasket, is best for your boat refrigerator. Far less cold air will seep out. The lid won't fly across the boat in a knockdown either. An outside surface that reflects heat will also do wonders to keep your refrigerator running more efficiently. Kaytal had a teak surround that frequently got warm to the touch in summer, and you know that's not good next to the box. If you decide to put a drain in the bottom for when you defrost, be sure that it has a trap in it, and the trap needs to be within the insulated area. An alternative is to be able to securely close the drain. Otherwise, hot air from the bilge, well, it may not be hot, but it's hotter than what's in the refrigerator, will rise into the refrigerator, and you'll be constantly having to cool it. With the freezer, there are all sorts of design possibilities. You can either have a separate freezer or freezer compartment within the refrigerator. The size of the freezer determines how much meat you can carry, as well as how many meals you can prepare ahead for a passage. But it takes a lot of energy to freeze foods in the first place, although not a lot to keep a full freezer frozen. My freezer on Kaytal was about half a cubic foot, and I found it adequate, but I would have loved a larger one. Now I have a 40-quart freezer. It's an Engel as a supplement here on Barefoot Gal, and I absolutely love it. Now, if you want to have ice, be sure to allow room for trays or anything else that you'll freeze ice in. Let's talk a little bit about your boat refrigerator brand. The longer we cruised, the more adamant we have become about buying brands and models within brands that lots of other cruisers are using, or that were composed of generic parts. Regardless of whether it was refrigeration or another system, over and over again, that having something that other people, both helpful cruisers and local repairmen, knew of and could get parts for, was not worth necessarily having the latest and greatest. Good repair manuals that you can actually get, off-the-shelf parts, and universal fittings are crucial once you get away from the original installer. I also like companies that will respond to technical support questions by email. The time to think about these issues is before you plunk your money down. Okay, as you work through all these questions, you'll almost certainly have to make some compromises to end up with a boat refrigerator system that works for you. The trick is to realize the trade-offs as you're making them, and not after the fact when things aren't working the way you envisioned. For example, a tiny box with thick insulation won't use much power, but will it give you the food and drinks you want? Refrigerator is an expensive piece of galley equipment, even more so if you have to add extra batteries and upgrade your power generation. As brands and models are always changing, I don't want to recommend specific systems, but as you talk to sales reps, realize there are numerous components to the refrigeration systems, and choices in each affect the others and your ultimate satisfaction. That's it for today. I'm hoping that you found this interesting, informative, helpful, whatever else you want to say. Please, if so, be sure to subscribe to the Boat Galley podcast and tell your friends about us.